people are singing, and in the middle of those mountains is the old city, the old Edomite capital called Petra. It is also standing and untouched by all of that seismic activity. The question is why? This is the southern end of the nation inhabited by Edom and Moab and the children of Ammon. Let them give glory unto God, verse 12, and declare his praise and his power. God will go forth as a mighty man. It's the time of his return. Isaiah chapter 33 talks about the area of Kedar as well. And I want you to notice what it says in Isaiah 33. Fascinating chapter. Isaiah 33. Very, very striking symbolism here. Verse 3, talking about the end of the age. Verse 3, at the noise of the tumult, someone's going to flee. At the lifting up of yourself, the nations are going to be scattered. Now, that isn't talking about one nation, but the whole world is going to be scattered. A time of awful worldwide tumult, and of spoiling, and of dying. And the end of the age in verse 5, someday Christ is going to dwell on high, but not quite yet. The earth is going to mourn and languish in verse 9. Talks about some Arab countries being destroyed, Lebanon as an example. Then, verse 13, hear you that are far off what I've done, and you that are near acknowledge my might. The sinners in Zion are afraid. Now, why are they afraid? Fearfulness has surprised the hypocrites. Who among us, they say, shall dwell with the devouring fire? Who among us will dwell with everlasting nuclear burnings? What they're saying, in effect, is who's going to survive? Who can survive this awful time? There's an answer here, verse 15. He that walks righteously, as servant of God will, and speaks uprightly, he will survive. He that despises the gain of oppressions and shakes his hands from the holding of bribes, that stops his ears from hearing of blood and shuts his eyes from seeing it. But the question then is where? In his house, at home, or someplace else? Verse 16 tells you where. He will dwell on high. That says in the mountains. Now Matthew 24 says, let him flee into the mountains. Which mountains? His place of safety, Isaiah said. That's what it says in the Hebrew. His place of defense shall be the fortress made out of rocks. Did you read that? The munitions, the Hebrew word is masad, and it makes you think of Masada, you know, the old fortress where the Jews held out before the time of Christ, 70 B.C., when those Roman zealots came up, and millions of them, I think, if I remember it, died. It was awful at Masada. You go to Israel, you can visit Masada. It comes from Masad, which means a fortress. It says, he will dwell in the mountains, and his place of safety will be the fortress made of, plural, Petras, made of stelas, made out of rocks. Now, you build a fort in the USA, it's built out of what? Well, it's only built out of, wood, and the old forts, they could set fire to them because they would burn. They were burnable. This is a fortress made of the rocks. That's interesting. Made out of Petras or stelas, plural. And bread shall be given him there, because there'll be no growing season at the beginning. We're going to have to create one. His waters shall be sure. Now, the rainy season in Petra, in the desert, in the Negev, and in that part of Jordan, in the southern part of the Sinai, goes from about October through March, sort of like ours, a little longer, and they get about as much rain as we do. They do get some. And some of that beautiful desert, and it gets beautiful in about the month of January, will literally blossom like a rose for a few weeks, and you can catch the water, though, you see. But at the beginning, we will have insufficient water, but God says he will work it out so our waters are sure. That involves some miracles. But someday in that location, our eyes will see the King in his beauty. Where? Will be in the munitions of rocks. When we see with our eyes, Jesus Christ coming, they shall also behold the land that stretches afar off. Now that is a bad translation in the King James. It doesn't say the land that is very far off. It says quite the opposite. It says they'll be able to see the land, meaning Israel, Palestine, that stretches afar off. And from the heights of Petra, if that is the place, by this time I think you've begun to realize I do have fairly strong convictions that it is, but that's only 99%. It could be a type. Could be a type. You can create this into a type. You're a better man than I am, but it could be a type. Anyway, from those heights, God says, you can see the land of promise stretching afar off. We're going to go up there pretty often and look at that land and say, that's it. In a few years, we'll be in that land with Jesus Christ. Not here in this Arab land, in that land. Your heart will meditate the terror, verse 18, but you won't be living in it. And you'll be saying, where is the scribe? That is the The military man who signs up the young soldiers, who enrolls them. Where is the receiver? That is the general who is the one that decides what tribute you bring. He's a military man. Where is he that counts the towers? That's the guy, the general, when there's going to be an attack, who counts literally the towers, who says, okay, here's the maneuver, the tactic we'll have to take that city. What he's saying is this, is you'll be able to see from the heights of the place of safety, military maneuvers you see, off in the land of promise, but there'll be no maneuvers where you are. They'll be afar off. They'll be someplace else. You shall not see, verse 19, that fierce people there. That munitions of rocks will be untouched by those military massive armies that'll, roll across the Middle East. You shall not see a fierce people, a people of a deeper speech, and all that type of thing. We'll escape that, and we'll see maneuvers. We will hear, maybe even see the MiGs and the Phantom jets screaming overhead, but they won't be able to drop bombs. We will see the rockets exploding at night. We'll see them exploding from the heights, because the land that will stretch on beyond Jordan that we'll be able to see, you see, is going to be the site of some of the bloodiest battles in all the history of mankind, and untold millions will die over there, and we'll be able to see it, but it will not touch us where we will be. No bombs will drop there. Now, I said for 3 years Jordan is going to be protected. And then for 6 months, only the southern end of the country where we are will be protected, but not the center and the north, because there's going to be an attack, and God will remove his promise. And, God will give that promise of protection to them for 3 years, to give us time to build, to give us access to supplies and to building materials and to so many things I'll talk to you about in a minute. And they'll have a promise of protection for us, and they'll be favorable towards us. God will work that out, and we'll build. And they'll sell us vehicles. They'll sell us anything we need. I would imagine they'll help us construct the irrigation canals and the ditches and the basins and help us build homes. And it'll be a wonderful thing. And they'll be prospered because of us. But ultimately, brethren, God is going to withdraw his protection from them after we have built the most magnificent city. I am convinced of that on the face of the earth. God will cut off that lifeline with the populated center in the northern part of the nation of Jordan. And he will leave us, in a sense, to our own devices. But we'll have a lot of company, because God says a lot of those Jordanians who helped us are going to be allowed to flee south where we are. We're going to have a big pack, maybe 30,000 unconverted Arabs, Jordanians, living with us in the place of safety for the last 6 months before Jesus Christ comes. I tend to think a lot of them are going to be converted during that period of time. Maybe there are reasons why God says in Kedar all these people are rejoicing. And in the villages of Kedar, you see, people are singing when Jesus comes. I don't think they'll be right in there with us. I think they'll simply set up 10 villages in the area. Notice Isaiah 16, just an unbelievable, incredible scripture. Isaiah chapter 16. Actually, Isaiah 15 gives the context, because the 15th chapter talks about the fall of Moab. Now, God in Daniel 11 said Moab would be protected, but he didn't say how long. It'd be about 3 years. Notice Isaiah chapter 15, verse 5. My heart will cry out for Moab, because ultimately the promise of protection is removed. And his refugees will flee unto Zoar. That's where Lot went, but there'll be no protection in Zoar. They will flee ultimately into the true place of safety. And notice, he will be like a heifer of 3 years. What does that mean, 3 years? Chapter 16, verse 14. But now the Lord has spoken, saying, within 3 years, as the years of a hireling, and the glory of Moab shall be condemned. That God is going to hire, in a sense, the Moabites to be our hosts and to help supply us with those needs that we have. And, we'll have favor with them. They'll help us build to some degree. And ultimately, if you notice chapter 16, verse 1, they'll be in the area of Petra. Now, the Moabites are in the central part of the country and the north. But here, as Jesus returns to the earth, you find them in the south. Chapter 16, verse 1. What are they doing in the south? Well, they're in the south because that's where we are, you see, brethren. And they'll be living in the tents and the villages of Kedar. Chapter 16. We're going to tell them this someday, and a lot of them are going to respond. Send you a lamb. That's a symbol of tribute and a thanksgiving to Jesus. When he comes, here are these Arabs, and you'll see these are Moabites, and they'll be living where? Send it to the ruler of the land. That's Jesus Christ, who'll rule the world, in fact, with that land too. It's going to be sent, a lamb is going to be sent from Selah, it says Petra. It's going to be sent, you see, through the wilderness, across Jordan, unto the mount of the daughter of Zion. Now, why do you have these Moabites from the central part of Jordan down in Petra, which is in the south, and that isn't their land at all? And as Jesus comes, they're sending tribute to him across the desert to Jerusalem and saying, in effect, we want to be submissive to you. Is it because a lot of them may have been converted as a result of contact with us? Question, I'm not sure of that. It shall be as a wandering bird cast out of his nest. So the daughters of Moab, central and northern Jordanians, shall be at the fords of Arnon, they're fleeing south. And God says this to them as they flee. Take counsel, execute judgment, make your shadow as the night in the midst of the noonday. As you flee, he said, be careful that you're not seen. They're going south, and God says to them as they flee south, make your shadow as the night. Even though you flee at noon, make sure you can't be seen. As the armies, the Russian armies, surged across northern and central Jordan, he said, don't let those armies see where you're going as you flee south. Why? Because you'll see in a minute, south, in the southern part of the nation, there are other refugees, there are other outcasts, and you'll find the outcasts of Moab are to protect the outcasts of the living God, the refugees, those who have already fled there. And there are two groups of people who will flee into southern Jordan. Notice verse 4 says, let my outcasts dwell with you, Moab, when you become an outcast. You have two groups, God's outcasts and the outcasts of the nation of Moab. And when does this occur? He says you're to be a cover to them, verse 4, from the face of the spoiler. The executioner is at an end. The spoiler ceases. The oppressors are consuming out of the land. In mercy shall the throne be established. That's when Jesus Christ comes. So after the 3 years, you see, protection is removed, and in the last few months, they flee south. And who's the invader of Moab? Who begins to surge across that part of the world? You need to understand this because I'll show you something in a minute, then we'll close a couple of minutes after that. Ezekiel chapter 25, you'll see that Jordan is going to be invaded by massive Oriental communist armies in the north and in the center, but not in the south. Not in the south. Chapter 25. Remember, the communists will come into the land of Israel, where the Europeans will be in charge from two directions. From the north, out of Russia, to the northern border from Lebanon, but they'll also come from the east, and the communist hordes of China and someday of Japan and of Vietnam and of India will roll across Iraq and Iran, and they'll join them, and then they'll surge, you see, across the southern end of Syria and across the northern end of Jordan into the land of Israel to take the city of Jerusalem from the east. Now, when that happens, we'll know it. When that time comes, we'll know it, because suddenly thousands of Arabs will be fleeing south to escape those armies, and we'll find them knocking on our door, and we'll be saying, you can't come in where we are, but you can make villages all around us, because God will protect you here. Ezekiel 25, verse 1, Son of man, verse 2, set your face against the Ammonites. Well, we're going to preach this to them someday. Ammon is the capital of Jordan. We're going to set our face against them. Some of you may even drive on up to Ammon someday. Maybe Mr. Armstrong will do this. And we'll say, okay, this is going to happen to you someday. Verse 3, say to the Ammonites, hear the word of the Eternal, thus says the Eternal God, because you said, aha, against my sanctuary. That was the sanctuary in Jerusalem when the Jewish place of worship is profane, and they laughed. They didn't mind. And against the land of Israel, our nations, when our nations go captive. And against the house of Judah, when the Europeans literally blitz the nation into smithereens, and the Jordanians say, serves them right, because you see a lot of Palestinians live in Jordan, and they're no great lovers of the Jews. Now, they'll love us. God will work that out, but not the Jews. Therefore, behold, I'll deliver you, verse 4, into the hands of the men of the east for a possession. That'll happen in those last few months after those 3 years of protection have been removed. And I will make Rabbah a stable for camels, verse 5, and they'll be destroyed, verse 7. I'll deliver you into their hands. And it'll happen, verse 8, to Moab and to Seir. I'll open the sides of Moab from the cities, and I will deliver Moab, verse 10, unto the men of the east, these 200 million strong communist hordes rolling across that part of the Middle East to take Jerusalem from the eastern side, across the West Bank. And so it goes. The men of the east, verse 10, will have that possession. Now, will some of them survive? Can some of them flee? Where will they go if some of them flee? This is going to happen, and most of the population is up in the north where it does happen. Notice Jeremiah chapter 48. Jeremiah chapter 48, verse 1. It is going to happen, and some of them will flee, and God says they can. He doesn't say stay in your cities and die, as these massive communist armies literally destroy and devastate all of northern and central Jordan and wipe the city of Ammon off the face of the map. Those people will help this to some degree. And God gives them a special blessing. Chapter 48, verse 1, against Moab, thus says the eternal host, the God of Israel, woe unto Nebo, that's in the north, and unto Kirianathaim, is confounded. And there shall be no more praise of Moab, verse 2. In Heshbon they've devised evil against it. Verse 3 of Jeremiah 48, a voice of crying shall be heard from Horonaim, spoiling and great destruction. Moab is destroyed, her little ones have caused a cry to be heard. Now what do we say to them? Verse 6, Flee. Save your lives and be like the heath in the wilderness. Verse 8, the spoiler comes to Moab. Verse 9, give wings unto all of these carnal Arabs. Wings, that they may flee and get away, for the cities thereof shall be desolate, with none to dwell therein. And where does God say they should flee? Verse 28, O you that dwell in Moab, in those last few months, leave the cities and go